Welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this Volume 3 of the Integralist Chronicles. I'm going to go back to about 1982, 1983. I'm living in a very strong Italian community in Southern California. Back in those days, when immigrants got off the boat, they ventured toward communities where there was other Italians. That's what we had, Italian neighborhoods. We also had Irish neighborhoods, right? German and Polish neighborhoods, things like that. Immigrants went where there was their own kind, where they could gather with, right? The church was always there as a sort of the central unity force of any culture. We all went to the same churches and things like that. And so Catholics and Italians especially, and of course other Catholic heritages, they congregated in these homogenous communities to give each other support, to have others around you who spoke the same language, have the same principles and same ideas. And it was always interesting because growing up as a boy from about, from the age of reason, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever that was, up until I was around 11, 12, 13 years old, the main other kids I hung out with and played with were my cousins. In Italian culture, Italian communities, cousins are like extended brothers and sisters, right? Because in Italian communities, the extended family is an important support network. It's very different, I noticed right away, from American families that, well, it's kind of, you barely keep your nuclear family together if your parents aren't getting divorced. And it was interesting because what had happened was, growing up with my cousins, there was a great joy, great pleasure. It was very familiar. We had same kind of cultural values. We went to the same church. We all went to catechism together to learn the faith and things of that nature. And, we did the best we can under those circumstances. But then, I remember playing in the neighborhood with another Italian kid, and where I was down the street from my house, and his grandmother lived there. He was hanging out with his Italian grandmother who had immigrated, probably in the 60s. I don't know when it was or something like that. And he said to me, "Hey, you want to go down to this, down the street here to the boys club?" And for those of you who don't know what the boys club was it was an attempt by the secular culture to try and give mainly boys that came from broken homes a chance at some community kind of outreach, kind of a thing toward these boys that came from broken homes. And it was really open to anybody, to be honest. But, it was a way at the time, because really the broken marriages, the divorce rate, the contraception, the illegitimacy that was rising throughout the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Society had to try and find a way to deal with these children that were coming from broken homes. And, something like a boys club was a secular way to deal with these social dysfunctions. It's interesting because the secular society creates the dysfunction, and then it gives these half-assed remedies to try and correct the problem that they created. Not that they ever admit that they created the problem in the first place. And so I said, sure, why not? And, just a place to hang out, play basketball, shoot pool, hang out with a bunch of other boys. And it's interesting because it was my real first exposure to pluralism, diversity. While here I was hanging out with a bunch of other Italians for the most part, I got down to the boys club there, local boys club in Los Angeles, where I was born and raised. And now I was interacting with other boys from different races. Now, I already been exposed to some of that in grade school when I entered kindergarten. And but when I got to the boys club, it was a much more direct kind of experience, right? I was hanging out with Hispanics, I was hanging out with Croatians, I was hanging out with Blacks, I was hanging out with really all different races. And there, like I said, I got my first exposure to pluralism. And it was unfortunate in many ways. Now, the experience was wonderful. Lots of great friendships that I admire to this day still, and things like that. But the problem was with those institutions was, again, it was a liberal, godless attempt to deal with these dysfunctions, the dysfunction that the liberal culture created in the first place. And America not having those overarching religious principles to build upon, to sort of rectify, or reinforce cultural norms is a problem. So what these institutions actually turn into is oftentimes something that's more damaging to boys than actually helping boys. Because what do you do in a secular society? Sure, you can encourage your basic common values and mores that everybody in general believes in. But when faith and religion aren't real, and there's no follow through on these sort of standards and mores that you're trying to build or infuse in young men that come from broken families. And immediately what that did was it devolved into moral depravity almost immediately, especially with no guidance from parents, no faith, no real culture there. And it was my first exposure to a completely morally decadent world that happened at a very young age. And so from there, lots of, experiences played out in my life, and lots of disorders were built as well too on my part. Again, being in this secular culture without any religious reinforcement of the value. See, I've said it so many times before. When you're disordered in a homogenous culture, like a strong Catholic devout culture, you have the cultural backdrop of the church that always reinforces sort of lots of the standards of the community and the greater religious principles of this homogenous culture. It's like when you go to Europe still to this day, right? Yeah, you still see the church at the center of the town, in the middle of the piazza, right? Because the church was always the cultural backdrop. It was the religious backdrop. It even had influence over the political system. So even if your family was somewhat disordered in that culture, there was still a community reinforcement of these great Catholic values. But in a secular republic like America, where we have religious indifferentism, where you can even get to reject all values and all standards in the name of freedom and liberty, that's when a bad situation turns into even greater chaos. My father was born in a time and age of great war and great poverty. His parents died, both of them, before he even turned the age of 1. And he wound up being raised by his siblings. And it never confused him growing up, because there was a family cohesion and a cultural cohesion in Sicily at the time. Even without parents in the home, Italians, Sicilians, in those religious societies always had a way to find themselves and find truth in these greater moral principles that the culture at large taught, because the church was there. And the values were embraced by the culture. And if your mom and dad passed away, or even if your mom and dad, for some strange way, they divorced, which in that world, divorce was very uncommon, there was still a greater community effort, outreach, principles that you were able to soak in and understand right from wrong still. But in this society here, who determines what right from wrong is, especially when we're dictating the ideas of individual autonomy? Who says what right from wrong is? Go read your Bible? Is that the answer? And I do want to touch on this notion about the Bible, which conservatives now are desperately clinging to this idea. Why is it that in the old world, that the church raised great saints, strong, rich cultures, beautiful, big families, and even economic prosperity without the Bible? How did that happen in Western civilization for 600 years? And then after the Bible is created, because of the printing press by Gutenberg, who was a Catholic, ironically enough, every nation that has embraced this idea of the Bible has gone, excuse my language, ape shit, batshit crazy, immoral decadence. Why is that? Why is it? I mean, the Bible has not ever been the book of America, and yet it hasn't worked. Because you need a visible, living, breathing authority that can reinforce these standards. The Bible in and of itself can't do that. The Bible is a wonderful document. It's the word of God. It's infallible, but you need an infallible interpreter to make sure we understand this. And you need a greater institution that enforces these notions, not this personal interpretation garbage, which is another great fallacy of America, where we adopted that at the founding. But let me get back to my story. So for me, it was strange, right? Because it really became two worlds for me. On one hand, I got my Catholic family over here. It's big, it's beautiful, it's cohesive, right? We believe in the same things. Yeah, every March we'd celebrate the Feast of St. Joseph, where the entire family will come to my grandmother's house, right? My grandmother and my grandfather had a wonderful devotion, great devotion to St. Joseph, right? It's from March 11th through the 19th. You do the novena for the first 9 days, and you have the feast day on the 19th, right? I believe that's where it was. 8 days. No, it's 8 days, and then the feast day on the 19th. And this was a big deal in our family, because it wasn't just immediate family, it was extended family that would partake of this big, beautiful event. It's something I remember very vividly. We would create these grand, beautiful altars. The women of the family, my aunts, would all come together, and they knew how to do it all up, this big, beautiful altar. The priest will come on the Feast of St. Joseph, bless all the food. We have the traditional foods of the old country. It was something that was wonderful. And it was beautiful because, one, it celebrated our faith, and it was the faith of the old country. See, Italians, Croatians, we try to maintain some of that in America, those traditions of the old world, because not too many people will admit this. I will. We saw fundamental problems in the American culture, right? And we saw Americans being different with different values. Again, the breakdown of the family was strange and odd to us, when Italian families were very cohesive, very together. Divorces hardly existed, at least in our grandparents' generation. It was almost non-existent. In our parents' generation, only when they came to America and liberalized were there some cracks in the dam when it came to the broken family and divorces. It was in my generation, those of us that were born here, that really began to struggle, right? With the sexual liberation and also in the materialism. It started creating fundamental problems as faith dies down, right? The one true faith, then the disorders increase. And so when I talk about Italians, divorce hardly kind of being a factor, I'm talking about that generation that came here, that first generation, right? Because like everything else, the disorders begin to pile up once you start, again, coexisting in a liberal society, because it infects everybody, regardless of religion, creed, race, whatever it may be. Everybody's infected by this disease of liberalism. And so that was the grand battle that we had. And but for many years, Italians tried to keep those sort of tight niche Italian communities. Yeah, I took a wonderful trip to Boston last October. It was a trip of a lifetime. I got cousins over there, my dad's side of the family over there, and they took us everywhere. And for one of the parts of the trip, we went up to the North End, which is basically Little Italy in Boston, down there in downtown. And you see what they've done down there to try and keep that Italian heritage alive. And it's a beautiful thing. You get the wonderful food, you get a lot of the souvenirs, things like that. They've done their best. But see, that's really turned into more of a financial incentive for those communities to keep that alive. Sure, they're going to keep it alive, but there's also financial incentive there. The fact is that those Italian communities, that whether they immigrated here in the 1880s or 1920s or 1960s, they've all been broken apart. And I think it's E. Michael Jones who wrote a book, and I haven't read it yet, that argued that Catholic communities were broken up on purpose by certain elements. I'm not sure if it's our government, or something to that effect. I haven't read, I can't make a claim. But those communities have all but broken down. And because we have a globalist economy, Italians and Catholics in general now have been forced to disperse all over the map to pursue, again, this economic engine of prosperity, right? You get your degree from college. Okay, now I got to get my job. Well, your job may not be where you were born and raised. Your job may be in Philadelphia, it may be in Chicago, it may be in New York, and you got to pursue that, and the family breaks apart. See, it's not just moral principles or moral precepts that have broken apart families. It's also been the economics, the global economics. And while conservatives today see a problem with globalism, for many years, they didn't have a problem with it, right? It was part of freedom and liberty, right? It's like this whole thing with corporations now, that conservatives all of a sudden feel that corporations are the big enemy. It's over the word fascism around everywhere. And I keep saying it's not fascism, it's just the oligarchical rule, which is a byproduct of democracy in the end. It's how the ancient philosophers sort of described what democracy turns into, right? And so this globalist economy splits us apart, but the moral decadence was there too. And as I highlighted in my last cast here, or my last volume 2 of this, I told you how there was a massive radical shift that I witnessed from the early 80s to the end of the 1980s. And it's interesting because everything is so out in the open now at this point in history, right? With all this disordered, kind of lifestyles that we're seeing now all over the media and the news and everywhere, public education, everybody's highlighting, even the corporations are in on it. But that point I made, I think in the last cast was that because our grandparents' generation in the 80s was still alive, and there was concept still of shame and blame, a lot of the moral disorders of the 80s were kind of hidden underground, right? You just kept it to yourself, right? You didn't tell anybody you were on the pill. Maybe mom and dad helped you get it because they didn't want you to get pregnant. Because a lot of times what happened was parents caved in because they're like, well, it's a highly sexualized culture. What am I gonna do? I don't want her to get pregnant. Let's put her on the pill. That happened a lot in all communities for that matter. Even abortions happened kind of secretively as these moral disorders increased. And so with the pill being in the open now and the sexual revolution running rampant in the 1980s, with the onset of pornography through the VHS tapes and really the youth losing, again, all control of their fallen nature and their sexual passions, the 80s was just a breathing ground, an underground breathing ground of moral depravity. By the time we get to the 90s, it all comes out in the surface, right? It all becomes public. It all becomes acceptable, right? I mean, I still remember, what was it? Tipper Gore, I believe it was, fighting against hardcore rock music in the early to mid 80s, right? And you had, groups like Twisted Sister or Protest, kiss my ass, stick it to the man kind of thing. We do what we want to do. We're Americans. This is freedom and liberty for us to do the music we want to do, right? Regardless of moral standards. And isn't that perfectly American? Let's be honest here. I know the conservatives are going to tell me, well, Frank, the founding fathers believed in moral order. They said a people that don't have moral order, then the republic is done. Okay, fine, but look what we've turned into. At some point, you have to accept what the country's turned into, and not simply the stated utopian intentions of what you believe the country is supposed to be, unless you have a mechanism to fix it. And what is that mechanism? Well, according to conservatives, it's going to the polls and voting. And we've seen how that's worked out at the end of the day, right? It's meant that people get to the polls or go to the polls and they get to vote for the candidates that justify their fallen nature and the disordered passions. That's what we see in America, what we've always seen. It's one of the great dangers of democracy. Truth is irrelevant. You vote for the candidate that's going to give you what you want, what you need, regardless if it's right or wrong, because again, there's no more arbitrary truth at the top. There's no church here to say, wait, hold it, stop, wait a minute, this is wrong. And two, the idea, again, one of the problems I've had woes with democracy is the idea that we can vote on good and evil, that we can vote on moral principles. See, this is the strange thing about post-Enlightenment democracy. On one hand, it's like, okay, we believe in certain moral orders, but on the other hand, as society becomes more disordered, you put it on the ballot so people can vote for it and then give that moral disorder legitimacy. See, in the old world, moral principles didn't get put on the ballot. The church said, this is right, this is wrong. It was settled. There was no debate. In America, we take all of our moral disorders and we put them on the ballot. And we do that because we need to give it legitimacy. We need to give sin legitimacy. And America has perfected the idea of giving sin legitimacy. See? So here we are now. I'm a kid that's coming from two worlds. I go home, I'm speaking another language, but that's fine because the language issue, it's the values at home, right? I'm going down to the local boys club, and every other word out of every other kid's mouth is the F word. I come home, that's the kind of language we don't use. It's not proper. It goes against the will of God. But again, if you're in a secular society with no overarching moral principles, other than if you choose to follow a certain set of religious principles or moral principles, nobody can tell you it's wrong. Can't. See, I think historian Charles Colomb said it best. And I always refer to Mr. Colomb because I think he's one of the wisest men out there. He said that America worked until the point where Catholics, Protestants, and Jews kind of agreed on the same things, right? America worked. But the moment we began to deviate away from this sort of these real common beliefs, and I think you see it right away with the Protestants, as the Protestants, again, legalized contraception in the 1920s, you see soon after that, the sexual revolution kicks off, right? You have the happy gay 1920s, right? You can do that because once the pill is made over the counter, it's not made over the counter officially in 1961, but it's happening in the country, don't get me wrong. Now sexual liberation happens. And that's why some would say that, you know, the 1960s was nothing more than the full fruition of what had happened 30, 40 years earlier. And I believe society really begins to change post-industrial revolution. And see, this is what's interesting about Italians. Italy never went really through an industrial revolution of sorts. Italy always remained agricultural for the most part. That's why when people say, you know, what we're seeing today in America with the corporate powers, it's fascism, it's fascism, it's fascism. I remind people, no, it's actually not fascism. You understand what fascism is. Italy didn't have that much industry. It had some, don't get me wrong, but it's primarily an artisan nation with heavy agricultural kind of, you know, standards and principles that people lived off. They lived off the land, and it was a massive fishing industry, right? Because the entire nation is surrounded by a body of water. They were people of the land. That's what they were. So here we are now in the midst of these liberal republics where now corporations have risen, right? Post-industrial revolution in America really changes life because it's when the average person starts to come off the land and into the cities, right? We see that as things become more mechanical in that sense. And we understand that was a time of the big international financiers, the JP Morgans and all those guys that really started to consolidate land in that respect at that time too. So America, post-industrial revolution, really liberalizes. A lot of it's kept underground. We don't got mass media. We got social media at the time, right? I think the 1960s is exposed as a full kind of evolution for that, because not only do we have TV, but we have TV in color for that matter. And technology is just getting more advanced and better so the media can program us all. I don't think we can ever underestimate the damage the media has done to present certain messages in certain given times at certain points in history to sell us on what sort of that culture or the status of the country was at that time. But we get to the 1960s and the sexual revolution of steroids. I still believe, and this is where my Protestant friends probably disagree, classical liberal friends definitely disagree, but when the pill is made over the counter, the contraception, 1961, I don't think it's a coincidence. Look at the numbers. Look at the fertility rate numbers, how they've absolutely declined since 1961. It's been just a rapid decline. It's been a collapse. We're not even replacing ourselves. But even more so, it changed the fundamental nature of men and women. It was soon after that women could go into the workforce. And the inflation of the 1970s cemented women working pretty much perpetually like a man. That changed the nature of the sexes. And that brought about the war of the sexes that we seem to be dealing with all the time, which is strange. Again, as a Catholic, it's strange because we were taught as Catholics that men and women are complementary creatures. We're supposed to work together. One's not better than the other. Each one has its own unique gifts that it brings to a relationship. But the pill changes that. The pill doesn't make us complementary creatures anymore. It gives women, with the rise of feminism, the ability now to be like men, act like men. So where there's no consequences now to the sexual nature. And we've been debating these reproductive issues now for what? Since the 1960s, since the pill was made over the counter. And abortion arises soon after that, just in case you forgot to take your pill the next day, just to clean up the problem, clean up the mess, just in case you screw up. These ideas were foreign to us immigrants because it wasn't like that in Europe. I mean, things were happening at times in Europe, don't get me wrong, especially in the more liberal cities. I can't speak for a place like, Turin or Rome, where it's more advanced up there. It's more, service sector. I don't know, not service sector. What's the word I'm looking for? It's more modernized. It's more liberal. But in the more conservative parts, the more religious parts, the more agricultural parts in Sicily, they really don't go through a sexual revolution there. Not at that time. Not at that time. Because you notice a difference between women especially. You notice that the women that were born in Italy and then immigrated here, but were never educated in the States, they kept those traditional values, right? Those values of purity, those values of valuing their husbands and being loyal to their husbands, and the value of raising children and raising families and being great mothers and great spouses for that matter. But the immigrants that got off the boat that actually did get educated in states, much more liberal, vastly more liberal. And their children, of course, once they're thrown in the public education sector, it's a free-for-all at that point, right? And that's why you see the devolution of the Italian family, the devolution of the German family, the devolution of the Polish family. And it's odd because for those of us that are first generation born here, we're raised with completely different standards than even what our parents were raised with in Italy. It's night and day. Our experiences and their experiences are night and day. I mean, one example I give you, apart from the moral depravity, is the economics, right? My family was more like those hardline cash on the barrel. You don't take out any debt. Debt is bad. But you come to America, the finances are a little different. And that is, we got a full-blown usury system that is praised as a virtue. In the old world, usury was a sin, right? The idea of excessive interest, right? Because you can effectively enslave somebody within the realm of an economic system. But in America, within the usury system, if you did not take out debt, you most likely fell behind. The whole cash on the barrel thing, very few have actually ever succeeded in America taking that attitude. In America, you take out as much usury debt as you can in order to get wealthy. That's night and day within those cultures, right? Call it good, call it bad. I think the chickens are coming home to roost on this usury thing, but we will see, right? We will see. But clearly, And I guess what I'm getting at here is the exposure of living in a liberal society, especially when you come from the old world. You get to see these two different worlds diametrically opposed to one another, and it's a tug of war. The problem is that you're surrounded, you're consumed by it, right? Again, no cultural reinforcements of the faith. First of all, as Catholics, we're not really allowed to publicly celebrate our faith, right? I mean, we can, okay, we have our procession around the church and things like that. We're allowed to do that in the name of religious freedom. I get that, fine. But it's more than that, right? The faith is celebrated publicly throughout all of the culture, right? In America, where we have this privatized religion, it's like, okay, all right, you know, everybody just keep to yourself, right? We don't dictate religious values. And with that comes the confusion of moral standards and a lack of community and a lack of cohesive values. And this is why Americans have been in each other's throats. And so my experience as growing up as a boy, right away, going to the boys club as I was, well, you know, with different cultures and races, I got a good look, a firsthand look at sort of the tribalistic divisions in America, right? Whether it was black versus white or Hispanic versus black or, you know, things like that. You saw it right away. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, and I mean, a young boy coming from a Catholic family, because we have this kind of moral standards and this social order and this cultural order and this cultural familiarity, I'm thinking to myself, how do you put this American culture together just within this little kind of framework of hanging out at a local boys club when I was a kid? How is this ever going to work if everybody is so opposed at every level and there's no common values to bring cohesion within society? And here we are in, you know, the year 2022, and we're at each other's throats more than ever before. And as the moral depravity has kind of increased over time and space, and religion has faded, the apostasy increased, we have now all these disordered issues that are just driving the culture mad to such a degree that even classical liberals and conservatives say, holy crap, what's happened to America? What's happened to America? And it's funny, because at one time for classical liberals, especially when I was in that camp in the 90s and early 2000s, America was that great hope of the world, right? It was that hope that represented freedom, liberty, economic prosperity. Everything that was ever good about the world was about America. And here we are, and about 2 decades later, and I see conservatives within the realm of despair. And the problem they have is they don't have an answer to this problem, because they've embraced pluralism. They've embraced religious indifferences. They've rejected the eternal truths of our ancestors. Where do you go from here, conservatives? How do you fix this problem? I don't know. I mean, as a Catholic, I have an answer. As an integralist, I have an answer. But as an American, you know, as I talk to more and more conservatives, I talk to quite a few of them, my conservative friends, they're in despair. And the answer of recent has been libertarianism. Just let them have what they want, and we'll take what we have, right? You do you, I do me. And as long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other. But isn't that what America has always kind of been? You want to double down on that? Because see, at the end of the day, it still takes an act of faith to believe that your enemy is going to respect your rules and your laws. And again, because you've rejected the more arbiter of truth, which is the church, that's what Christ left us. Those same progressive offspring, or progressive siblings, I like to say here, don't have to respect your ideas of libertarianism. They don't have to respect your private property rights. And they're coming for everything we own, everything we have. They're not going to leave you alone. You're asking a Catholic here who are, through our ancestral roots, we lost everything because of liberalism. Catholics were invaded by classical liberals in the West and Marxists in the East. How is it that Catholics wound up with no nations? Don't give me some small island. No, how is it that Catholics wound up with no nations post-World War II? when the entire European continent was Catholic at one time. The Jews wound up with Israel after World War II. And I ain't got no problems with Jews having their own nation. I'm just saying, where are the Catholic nations at? Under Catholic governance. Oh, that's right. We got Poland out there. That's right. Poland. But that took what? Lots of great pain and suffering throughout a Cold War to get that. In a strange kind of way, I think communism incubated the faith. Hungary's doing pretty good. But notice how Poland and Hungary are despised by classical liberals. Absolutely despised, right? Authoritarian rule, they would tell you, right? It goes against freedom and liberty. Okay. Is Poland worse off than America is today, conservatives? Is Hungary worse off than America is today? We got this thing falling on top of us today. And before we start trouncing around the world and judging everybody else because they're not subscribing to the very same concepts of liberty that have destroyed the West post-Enlightenment, I think is a little short-sighted, to say the least. That's all I'm saying. Yeah, Poland and Hungary govern more like integralist nations. I think there's some value there that we ought to consider. Right? I'll say it again. Post-Enlightenment, post-French Revolution, name me one nation in the world that has embraced these liberal principles and has not become some sort of quasi-Marxist state. Can you name me one? No, because even now, my friends on the right are saying, oh my God, good Lord help us. America's becoming Stalinist. That's what I'm hearing, ladies and gentlemen. There you have it, volume 3 of the Integralist Chronicles. This is Frank. I want to thank you for joining me. Good night, everybody.